Hello everyone. So the purpose of this video basically is to solve the second question from lab 5B. All right. And for this question, you're supposed to basically create a flowchart. For a method, you're supposed to name it find largest to find the largest value in a list of positive numbers entered by the user. Now, uh, given that the list always finishes with a negative number, and the user will enter the numbers one by one and the method will check each number as they get entered. So basically you need to keep asking the user for a positive number, and as soon as you encounter a negative number you stop, you end asking the user for a number, and as soon as that negative number is provided to you by the user, you're supposed to finally display the largest number that the user had entered. Now, if you look at the the example output in the question, you can see how one by one, if the user enters a positive number, the program needs to ask the user to enter another number again, and that happens until the program finds a negative number, and when you find that negative number you stop the loop and then you print the maximum number that the user gave you. Okay, so in order to solve this question, the first thing we need to do is we need to draw a flowchart. Okay, and we know that a flowchart needs to have a start. For that we need a terminator, and you can just write start. Okay, now once you have that, you need to figure out what are the variables or objects that you or data types that you would need for building this program. Okay, so in this case we need we need a integer variable so that we can take the positive number from the user. All right, and then we need let's say a scanner object for reading that input from the user, and then we also need a variable to store the largest number that the user gave you. Now, because the input is int, which means the user is giving you an integer, so the data type for the maximum value will also be int. Okay. Now, for storing all of that details, you need to use the data component for the flowchart. All right, and here we can just write declare and create scanner object int input for number int max for max largest number. Okay, so these are the four things I feel we require for the program. And if you code in a way, or if the program requires more data types or variables, then you just mention them within the same component. Okay, now after that we need to start reading, right? We don't check in the beginning itself if whatever number okay, before that we need to read input from the user. That is understood, because we need to we need the input from the user to basically compare it, right? So we can find the largest one, the largest number. So basically what you require right now is a process. Okay, and this would mean that you do three things. If you remember from the previous flowcharts, you need to prompt user for input for a, let's say, for a positive number, store read input from user, store, or you can even use assign input to int input variable. Okay, so those are the three things. Whenever you prompt a user, you need to say that you need to write three things: prompt, read, and assign. So you prompt the user for whatever the question asks you to prompt. You read whatever the input is required from the user, and then you assign that input to whatever variable you mentioned in the data block. Okay. Now, after this, we need to check if the number that the user entered is greater than the maximum value that we have. But if you know, if you think about it, initially the value of max, we don't have any. It's empty, right? We did not assign anything to max. Here we assigned to input the int variable, but apart from that, we did not really assign anything to max. Usually what you do in these cases is you would assign, let's say, a default value of 0, so that at least your program doesn't crash if it's trying to make comparisons between variables that don't have a value, right? So either you create another process block or component, or you use the same one. It's up to you. Doesn't really matter as long as you understand what needs to be done. So here you can say max basically is, or you can write it. You can say assign max to 0. Okay. That would mean that initially you're giving it a value of 0, so that anytime you try to, access that variable, it doesn't crash because it doesn't really have a value. It's just like if it is just like if you store, for example, if you have a box and you don't store anything and you're looking for something in that box, you wouldn't find anything, right? So that's the same thing that happens with variables. If you don't have a value stored in it, and the program is trying to find a value to compare it with in a condition or somewhere else, then it just crashes because it's going to tell you that there is no value. So how can the comparison be made, right? So in that case, usually we always initialize our variables with a default value. A default value for int could be 0. A default value for string could be an empty string. A default value for whatever, yeah, Boolean usually is false. A default value for Boolean is false usually. So something like that. Okay. So after this, after you prompt, read, and everything, now you're going to check, because we're checking, we'll use a decision block. We'll check if the value of the input that the user gave, is it greater than max or not? Okay, so I'm going to check if the value of input that we have from the user, is it greater than max or not? If it was greater than max, then I need to update the value of max to the same as input. For example, let's say initially max is 0, right? And let's assume that the user gave you an input of 7. Now 7 is actually greater than 0. So in my max variable, I need to change the value of it to 7 to record that 7 is the maximum or the largest value that the user gave me, right? So for that, I will use a process again because it's an action, and I'll say assign input to max, or you can even write it as max is equal to input. Okay, and this happens only when the condition is true, basically. Okay, now, sorry, true. Okay, now if if it is not, now this is all we need to do for this condition. Okay, if it was false, then we don't need to do anything, right? If let's say the user gave me -1, which is less than 0, I don't really care because all I'm required for this question is to look for positive numbers, right? So that means I really don't need to have any action for, or any process for the false side. Okay, so that means there will be no else statement for this condition. Now we have a decision and then we're checking, okay, if the input is this, it's correct. Now we also need to check something regarding, let's say, if here, for example, the user enters a negative number, we need to make sure that the user doesn't enter that negative number, right? And that is the condition for the loop. Because how do we know it's the condition of the loop? There are two conditions. In this case, there's a condition to check if input is greater than max. That's one of your conditions. And then there is another condition, which is to check if your number is negative or not. How do we figure out which condition should be for the loop? You figure that out based on whatever stops the repetition in your question. For instance, here it says, write a method to find the largest value in a list of positive numbers entered by the user, given the list always finishes with a negative number. That means as soon as you enter a negative number, the program will stop asking the user to enter a number. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So I know that that will be my condition for ending the loop. So again, we need a decision. Don't worry about connecting all of it in the beginning. Just whatever you figure out from the question, start creating those components. And then you will realize that everything will start falling into place once you know, are near to end the question or something like that. Okay, so in this condition, we'll have if input is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so that is going to be my condition for the loop. Now that means if this condition is true, it needs to go back somewhere. That is the purpose of loop, right? So here it should go back and prompt me again, right? It shouldn't go back and assign max to 0. Otherwise, if it does that, then we'll always end up having max as 0 and we'll never be able to figure out the largest value, right? So in this case, what we're going to do is we'll go back to prompting the user for a positive number if this condition was true. Okay, so this is here, this is here, and this is here. And just make sure you always mark the branches. So this branch is basically true. So it goes back to prompting the user again. But if it was false, then we need to do something. We don't just end. If it was, which means if the user gave you a negative number, you need to basically, okay, I think it's not mentioned here. But I think if you read the whole question, it says that you're supposed to basically display the largest number that you find from that list of numbers. Okay, so if it was false, I'm going to have a process that prints the maximum number. Okay, and then basically there is a end. Okay, so now comes the connecting part. I know that this start is going to be directed here, which is very easy. This is getting directed here. That's easy. Again, this gets, let me make it small so I have more space. And then this gets directed here. Okay. Now I know that, okay, this is again will get connected here. And after this, I know that I have a true branch. All right. And I know that for every decision, you need to have a true branch and a false branch, right? So I have a true branch. I need to now create a false branch. Now there is no action that happens on the false branch, that means there is no else, right? So all I can do is I can just literally connect it this way. Okay, so if the condition was false, it will go and check the loop condition. I don't know why it's not allowing me. Let's just write it here, false. Okay, and here I know, if you remember that from the previous flowcharts, we need to have all the components basically connected with one another. If I look here, this is something that is left out, right? So again, I'll just probably connect it to here. So it does the same thing after after assigning the input to the max. Okay, so after you assign the max, you want to go back and check if input is greater than or equal to 0. You go back and check again. Okay. Now we have these left. I know that the true branch for this decision is connected. So I'm going to connect the false branch here. Okay, let it be this way. Write it as false. And then towards the end, you can just connect end to here. Oh, sorry, there's no text here, so that's fine. Okay, so that will be your flowchart for this question. You have a start, you declare the objects, the variables that you require, you assign max to 0 because we don't need any, we don't need the program to break just because the variable doesn't have a value initially. And then you prompt the user for a positive number, read that input from the user, and then assign that input to the input variable that you have created. And then you check if input was greater than or equal greater than max. If it was, then you go and assign input to max, which is equal, which will be max is equal to input. Otherwise, you just go and check the loop condition. If the loop condition was true, you go back and prompt again. If it was false, you just print the maximum value and then just end the program. Okay. So the next part, for the next part, we will code this whole thing. All right. All right. So now let's try to code this. If we read the question, it says we were supposed to create a find largest method. So for that, you have to create a method below the main method, which is here. So I'll just write on line 11 public static, just following the same pattern as the main method, public static. And then we are not supposed to return anything. The question doesn't mention anything about return. So I'll be using void keyword, and then you have to write the name, which is find largest. And again, it doesn't talk about taking any parameters from the user, so you don't need any parameters. And the block brackets. Now, within this, the first thing we need is we need to declare and create scanner object. So for that, I will write scanner scan is equal to new scanner system.in. Okay, and then I will click on add import, and that should import my java.util.scanner. Okay, now once I'm done with that, let's look at the next thing. We need int input for the number. Okay, so I'll name it int input, and then we need another int, which is for the largest number. So instead of writing int max again, I'll just write max. I'll just put a comma after input and write max. Now, if here you see it says assign max is equal to 0, which I can do here itself. All right, and then at the end, you need a semicolon. So the data type, you just write once, the first variable name, comma, second variable name, and then you can even have the initialization along with the variable. This would mean that max variable has a value of 0. If you wanted to give a default value for input also, you can do it this way. That's fine. Okay. Now, once I'm done with that, I need to, so we finished this part. Now I need to prompt user for a positive number. That means I need to print something so to let the user know that please enter a number, right? So they know what to provide you. So enter a positive number. Okay. And then I need to read that input using the scan, which I can write it as scan dot next. Because it's int, I'll use next int, and then that value. So I just wrote the code for read input from user, and then I need to assign that input to int to the int input variable, which is this way. Okay, so this part is for reading, and this part you assign whatever you read from the user here, you assign it to input. Okay, so now we have that input, but okay, after that we need to check if input is greater than max. Okay, so I'm going to write if input is greater than max, what should happen? Assign input to max, or max is equal to input. So max should be equal to input. So if the user gave you, let's say, 20, and the initial value of max is 0. So we need max to become 20, right? Because that's the largest number between the two. So after we've done that, we know that there is no else part, so we don't need to write else. If there was, how do we know there's an else part? If it was something like this, you have a false and then you have a process next to it. That would mean that there's an else part for that. Okay. Now, once that is done, we need to okay. Once we're done with that, we need to write a condition which is if input is greater than or equal to 0. But if you notice, this the true branch for this condition or this decision goes back to a previous statement. Okay, that means that this is basically a loop, right? It goes back to a condition, it goes back to a statement, right? And we know that after that statement we'll follow the same process, and if it's true, we'll keep repeating that process, right? So in this case, we know that we require a loop. But how do we know which loop is required in this case? So we know that the action in this case is comes before the loop condition, right? So if you remember from the different loops we have, the loop condition, if the loop condition is at the end and your block is getting executed before the condition, then that's probably a do while loop. The other two loops, they have their condition at the beginning, and once that condition is satisfied, only then you execute those block of code for the for and while loop. So in this case, it is going to be a do while loop. Now, how do I know from where I'm supposed to write that do while loop? Right? So I know that there's a prompt statement, which is probably here. So I can just put do before that, okay, and write the condition here, while input is greater than or equal to 0. Okay. Now there's a keyword. Now this is kind of messed up. It should be intended properly, right? So there's a keyword for that. It's Alt, Shift, and F. If you press those keys together, it's going to format your code in a very professional way. Okay, so once we're done with that, okay, so we're done with this part. if if the loop condition was false, then what we're supposed to do, we're supposed to print the largest number, and that ends the program, right? So here I can just print largest, or the maximum number is, and then I can just write max. So that's going to print the maximum number. Now, because this is a program, I need to call this method, otherwise it's not going to run the program, right? So here I can just write find largest, and that should run my program. So if I try to run this, it should ask me for a number. Let's say, let's enter 9, let's enter 8, let's enter 10, let's enter 89, and let's enter -2. So the maximum number is 89.